I'm Perry Barlow, and I'm very, very glad to be in Iceland. I've been wanting to be in Iceland as long as I knew there was such a place. It's funny. I mean, when I was a little kid, I had this kid's encyclopedia, and I was out by myself on a large cattle ranch in Wyoming, which Iceland looks remarkably like. Or actually, from your perspective, Wyoming looks a lot like Iceland. And I saw the Iceland entry, and I saw the pictures of the people and the pictures of the country, and even though I lived in country like that and around people who look kind of like you do, I thought, God, that must be a special, magical place. Someplace like my place, but not. And it is a special, magical place. I've felt myself both at home and completely estranged since I got here. And I have a lot of thoughts about what Iceland can do as a country, as one of the points of contact with cyberspace, and cyberspace is both global and local. And actually, the more local it becomes, the more global it becomes. And this is just one of the many difficulties that we find ourselves confronting as we enter the virtual world as a species. For a long time, human beings were in a position where if they wanted to communicate with one another, they were down to hand signals, essentially, since they didn't have language. I mean, at least 250,000 years went past while there were Homo sapiens on the planet, but they didn't have the power of speech. And more to the point, they didn't have the power of abstraction. Nothing had a name. It was. Now, I think that's probably a very happy condition, and I say that as a part-time Buddhist. I think it would be great if we could get our minds so clean of preconceptions that, you know, everything was that and not something that comes in a context of overlays and words. But that's not the direction that we had to head at first, and a miracle happened about 40,000 years ago. Almost exactly 40,000 years ago. For some, but that's by carbon dating anyway. For some reason, human beings all over the planet, human beings that were not in any way connected with one another, acquired two things overnight. They acquired the ability to speak words that were intelligible and meaningful, and they acquired the ability to use tools and make tools. And this happened in Africa, it happened in Europe, it happened in Asia. There's increasing evidence that it happened in the Americas, involving people who'd been there all along but didn't survive the onslaught of the people who now call themselves Native Americans. And at that point, it really is kind of like the Garden of Eden. Because for the previous 250,000 years, human beings had been like every other animal on the planet. They came into the world was as it was, and they adapted to it. Horses do this. Even extremely intelligent animals like porpoises and ravens and parrots don't come into the world and decide to fix it. But as soon as we had tools and as soon as we had language, we set about to fix the world. I mean, my personal feeling is that they should call us Homo dissatisfactans, because that is the characteristic that I think sets us apart from all other critters. We have this unscratchable itch that makes us want to solve problems even though I think some of us are wise enough to know that if we solve that problem, the solution will breed at minimum 3 or 4 new problems. We can imagine if you got a system like that, which we do, civilization will follow. Technology will grow because every time you solve a problem, you have 2 or 3 new problems. Next thing you know, you got a big old hotel in Iceland, which I think is something of a solution. I have another theory of history, which is that it's all about impressing the women. But that's probably not entirely relevant here. It might be slightly. But when we started trying to fix the world and developing tools with which to do so, we necessarily encountered the desirability of communications at a distance. And the only way we could do that for the longest time was to send somebody out on foot that we knew was fast with something that we had written, because we could write then. And then we managed to bring the horses into camp, and so then we could set somebody out on a horse. That was better. And that was really, to a large extent, how things prevailed for quite a while. I mean, I grew up on a big cattle ranch, like I said, in Wyoming. And my mother, who was born in 1905, spent the first quarter of her life in a condition where the fastest way to move information was a galloping horse. Didn't have a telephone. I mean, I suppose she could have used smoke signals, but they probably wouldn't have worked that well because the nearest ranch was 4 miles away. There'd be no telling whether or not the people up there would be looking that direction. So even as recently as 1905, we were still, as a species, in a relatively primitive condition. But the real event had already taken place. And the real event, to me, is what happened in 1837 when Samuel F.B. Morse sat down at a telegrapher's key in Washington, D.C., and tapped out some dits and dots. And somebody in Baltimore, Maryland, 27 miles away, interpreted those dits and dots and said, "What hath God wrought?" Because that was what Samuel F.B. Morse said. And at that moment, for the first time, you had 2 people removed by a considerable distance who were, in a sense, inhabiting cyberspace. They had just gone through the magic door. They'd just fallen down the rabbit hole, those guys had. And telegraphy revolutionized the world immediately. By the time Lincoln was assassinated, it was possible to know about it in London the next morning instead of waiting for the ship to come. And the human race suddenly started to develop this entirely new layer of its own thought, because we could now communicate at a distance, and we could do so increasingly with very, very complex material. Still, for my mother, it hadn't happened there. By the way, when she died in 99 at the age of 94, she was doing email quite well. So she saw all those things happen. And as an interesting aside, one of the things that always struck me was that even though she had seen the entire history of modern telecommunications happen before her eyes, whenever she told a story, and she liked to tell stories because she remembered every time anybody screwed up, and it took her it gave her great satisfaction to return to that moment and blame that guy all over again. I once got her a bumper sticker that said, "Shit is caused," which meant by somebody, and I remember who it was. But when she told stories, technology never showed up in those stories, in spite of the fact that it was always an important element in terms of how the story went down. It was just not important in the real sense, because what was important was what's usually important, which is the mysterious dance of the 7 deadly sins and the 3 graces. And that has gone on being the case as we advance ourselves. In any event, I'm going to return to the history of information here for a little bit. So we've got the radio, pretty soon, which gets ripped off from Tesla. His intellectual property is stolen by Sarnoff, or first by Marconi, and then by Sarnoff. We've got things like piano rolls, so that it's possible to have music that we can play on the piano that we didn't learn how to play ourselves. And at that point, there started to be, in the Western world, an uneasiness about how to regulate the relationship between the people who created the music that was going to be played on your piano with a piano roll, and also the original player and you. Heretofore, if you wanted to hear a song played by somebody who was really good at it, possibly even the person who wrote it, you had to be there. It's kind of like back with Erg and Mog, sitting outside the cave prior to 40,000 years ago. You had to be right there where you could detect what they were pointing at and what they were trying to get you to do. And the composers and the authors, as they put, that's what they call lyricists, and the publishers of sheet music freaked out and started to try to wrap a bottle around this and make sure that piano rolls didn't destroy live music and didn't destroy another thing that was about to come on, which was the record, which was invented shortly thereafter. And there was a lot of fuss and furor about how to do that, but it's still at that point, we had a pretty clear sense that the best way to regulate the economics of this stuff, whatever it is, the value of expression, was through actual delivery, through execution. And the second best way, if that couldn't be achieved, as in the case of piano rolls, the second best way was to give somebody a temporary license on a monopoly for expressing that thing. Now, it didn't mean they owned that thing. And in fact, the guy who wrote our copyright law in the United States, and indeed was in his first public office, the United States Patent Commissioner, a guy named Thomas Jefferson, said as follows about this regarding owning ideas, or owning the thing that is being conveyed itself, and not merely owning the ability to wrap it exclusively yourself in some kind of bottle that you've created, like a book. If nature has made anything less susceptible than all others of exclusive property, it is the action of the thinking power called an idea, which an individual may exclusively possess as long as he keeps it to himself. But the moment it is divulged, it forces itself into the possession of everyone. And the receiver cannot dispossess himself of it. I mean, try to will yourself to forget something. You'll drive it in deep. You'll engrave it on tablets of bronze before you'll forget it. You try that way. He who receives, its peculiar character too is that no one possesses the less because every other possesses the whole. He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me. That ideas should spread freely from one to another over the globe for the moral and mutual instruction of man and improvement of his condition seems to have been peculiarly and benevolently designed by nature when she made them, like fire, expansible over all space, without lessening their density at any point, and like the air in which we breathe, move, and have our physical being, incapable of confinement or exclusive appropriation. Inventions, then, cannot in nature be a subject of property. That's what Jefferson thought. That is not what Carrie Sherman, the head of the RIAA, thinks. Or the new guy who's taken over from Jack Valenti, I can't remember his name, at the MPAA. Or anybody in WIPO. Or actually anybody in a large set of other institutions. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So you got this rapid increase in technologies of information. And you get the telephone, which is really one of the great personalized cyberspace access points. I mean, when I first started popularizing the term cyberspace, which I'd borrowed from a friend of mine who'd written a science fiction novel in which that was a phenomenon. I mean, I kept trying to, as I was trying to figure out a way to give the folks that were online that had, in my view, a unique set of political characteristics and had a real constituency and a real set of goals and rights that were not previously seen to by anybody. As I tried to figure out how to give them a political identity, it seemed important to name the place or space where they were, and so I came up with a bunch of my own names for a while. Datasphere, Infosphere, stuff like that. And finally, I read Neuromancer, and I thought, well, that's a great word. I like the sound of it. And furthermore, it's really ironic because cyber means control, and then there's the irony of space where there is none. It's all complete mental space. There's no physical space in there. So I called it cyberspace, and when I was trying to tell people what cyberspace was, I would say cyberspace is where you are when you're on the phone. Where's that conversation taking place? It's taking place in cyberspace. It is. Now, we didn't notice that as being all that dramatic because it was just two people talking at first. It was not a larger conversation. There was no sense of inhabitation. It was not an environment, which it was shortly to become. When I was in college in the 60s at a very hip Eastern university where, we didn't experiment with drugs. Well, we did, actually. We took some that I don't even know the names of. Didn't take some of those again. But we certainly were taking a lot of psychedelics, which tends to make you look at things in a more comprehensive and connected sense. And at that point, I was also reading the works of a fellow named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Anybody here ever hear of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin? Nobody. Oh yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. All right. What Pierre? Let me tell you about him. He was an anthropologist and a paleontologist and an evolutionary theorist who worked in China for about 30 years and was the discoverer of Peking Man, the skull that was the first Asian early man to be found. And he was also, in fact, a Jesuit priest. And he came up with this idea that what we were doing as a species with all of this information stuff was creating a nervous system for ourselves and a whole new ecosystem for thought, which once it was wired up, once it became sufficiently dense, would be a mind capable, as he put it, of keeping God company. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that, I mean, because I don't know about the other party. There may or may not be one, and on the assumption there is one, I'm respectful. And this really seemed right to me. It seemed like what was going on really in the world was everything was connected to everything, and we were just trying to make ourselves see this. Everybody was already connected to everybody in some spiritual sense. And we were trying to take the collective unconscious and create on top of it a collective consciousness. We were trying to create mind with a capital M. Now, you could look around and you could see evidence that this had already happened. For example, Newton and Leibniz both came up with the calculus, which is not a particularly intuitive thing to come up with, in the same fortnight. Leibniz spent the rest of his life trying to prove to Newton that he ripped him off. I mean, excuse me, I've got that backwards. Newton spent the rest of his life trying to prove that Leibniz had ripped him off and actually did nothing further that was of any use. He was so determined to recover his stolen intellectual property that he let one of the great minds that's ever been born to a human being be used for such tawdry purposes. Leibniz, on the other hand, went on and invented the bit, or discovered it, realizing that the only reason that we had base 10 numbering systems was that. And you could actually have base 37 numbering systems. You could have base 116 numbering systems. You could have numbering systems that were, zeros and ones. You could make the entire universe out of zeros and ones, Leibniz realized. By the way, he wrote a letter to the Emperor of China saying this, and saying that it disproved the emperor's idea of a monad, that everything was one. Those were the days, boy. And 4 years later, he gets a letter back from the Emperor of China, which is a translation into Latin of the Tao Te Ching, which kind of says, well, I see your point, but we have a different way of doing this with the yin and the yang. But I felt that there was definitely a mind with a capital M that was being created, and it wasn't just the acid; it was the truth. And so I was big into doing whatever I could to help that along, but I didn't know what it was, and so what I did instead was to go off and become a cattle rancher for about 20 years and think about it. When it became clear to me that cattle ranching was on its last legs, since I was having to compete against people who didn't have to earn a living doing what I was doing, since it was a lifestyle choice, really it was for guys that had mergers and acquisitions firms that wanted to go around in their pickup somewhere in Wyoming with their new mistress and say, yep, there's my cows. Men will pay a lot of money to do that. So they were chasing me out of the market because there was no functional bottom. These guys would not shake out. And I started to try to think about what I wanted to do with myself, and I got an odd offer from Apple Computer to go to Silicon Valley and write a people's history of Apple, which was, you know, by virtue of being the weirdest offer I'd received, not knowing anything about computers or Apple. I said, yeah, sure, I'll try that. And of course, when I got out there, I realized that Apple was hugely mythological. It was a reality distortion field that had been created in the general vicinity of Steve Jobs, who has a way of making these things. So I didn't want to write that book. But I did, at the same time, somebody gave me an ARPANET account. And the reason they did, I've been complaining. I wrote for a band in the United States that many of you probably don't know because it was a very American phenomenon. It was a big deal in the United States. And we had followers, it was called the Grateful Dead, and we had followers that were called Deadheads, and they were devout. I mean, they were kind of like Scientologists, only, you know, not so well groomed. And they also had something that I thought was really interesting, which was a sense of community. In my very precise terms, having come from a small agricultural town in Wyoming, where community is fundamental, like it is in a lot of places on this island. You know, where it is an extension of family, and it is something that you know that you are connected to in every way. And I felt it dying off in America. It was being the victim of television, which makes its money by selling the attention of the audience to the advertisers, and therefore has a strong incentive to create passionate emotions in the advertiser in the audience, so they won't click on up or down through the 500 channels at their disposal. And that is something that will attach itself to fear, sexuality, or violence. So it's in television's best interest to create this very peculiar world that is terrifying and violent and sexy. Well, this scares most people and makes them stay at home in the suburbs, and is the very death of community, along with the modern corporation, which deals with people as though they were interchangeable machine parts. So community seemed to be dying in America every place besides where I was, and that was dying because we were running out of money to go on having small family agricultural outfits like we did. And somebody said, and I said, well, the Deadheads have a kind of community. I'd like to find out what that's like. But I'd go out in the parking lot at a show or something and start asking questions, and they knew who I was. And, you know, strange as it may seem, I had sort of a godlike power with the Deadheads, and it would completely distort the answer. It was like it was kind of like Heisenberg's principle of sociology. You know, I would so distort the thing that I was trying to study that it wasn't worth studying it that way. And also, I couldn't figure out how they had a sense of continuity, which I think communities require. You know, everything was interrupted by on to the next city, and then the tour is off the road for 3 months, and there's nothing. And my friend who worked at Stanford at that point said, well, why don't you get yourself an ARPANET account? There are a lot of deadheads on the ARPANET working for defense contractors and computer science departments in college that have a continuous sense of presence. They have these chat groups. And I said, all right. So I did what was necessary to configure a Hayes 300 baud modem, which without help in those days was a bitch. If you're a cattle rancher and you've got a Hayes 300 baud modem and a compact, luggable PC clone, trying to get that thing to connect to a phone line is a heroic act. But I got it to connect, and lo, I typed in telnet, and then typed in a computer at Stanford that I knew the name of, and Shazam. I was a part of that computer. I was connected to it. I could make a hard disk spin all over the world. Now, at that point, there weren't a lot of hard disks to spin because there weren't that many machines on the internet. But I had a real holy vision at that point, which was that Teilhard de Chardin had been right, that we were making the nervous system of the collective consciousness that would far surpass what was able to communicate the calculus to both Leibniz and Newton. And I just instinctively wanted to be a big part of that. And I instinctively knew that if you take everybody in humanity, and I figured that sooner or later everybody in the human race would have an email address. And you know, you could just do the math. You could see how it was doubling. It was a doubling phenomenon. At that point there were maybe 150,000 people with email addresses. But the next year there were 300,000. And finally it just headed up. And I think we'll have probably 2 billion before the end of next year. And it's growing. I thought if you're going to take all of humanity and put them into the same social space where they don't have clothes, and they don't have buildings, and they don't have anything really to show who they are. They don't have property, maybe. They don't have jurisdictional boundaries. Maybe you can't use law in there. Somebody ought to be writing about this, because this could be the most important thing that's ever happened since the capture of fire. I still believe that. People thought I was giddy and over-optimistic at the time. I'm not being over-optimistic. I mean, fire has brought us a lot of things. You know, not all of them great. So I knew this was going to be very important, so I dropped the whole thing with Apple, and I decided I was going to start writing about the internet and getting to know the people who were making it, and also thinking about how to deal with the social issues that were developing, and the political issues, and the cultural issues, and the economic issues. And in those days, you know, you could be a broke-down cattle rancher and rock and roll lyricist and set yourself up as an internet guru, and it would stick just because you said you were one. I mean, the next thing I knew, I was. Life is funny. But it was helpful, because what the internet needed at that point was somebody to protect it from its natural enemies, which was that set of institutions and individuals who do now and have since Erg looked up at Og and said, "Rock," and had both the rock to throw at him and a word for it. Those people have been using information and the ability to constrain and control the access to information for the purposes of power since that moment. Control of information has been enormously large in the way in which mind has formed. Because if you can control what a person can observe about the distant world, or what he can think about it on the basis of language, and the information that you let that person have, you've got that person far more in your control than if you go after him with guns and tanks. Because that'll make him mad, and you know, he'll come back at you as we're finding in Iraq. Even though he doesn't have very, very sophisticated tools, he'll find a way to get rid of you. But language, if properly controlled and constrained, is so powerful that he won't even think to get rid of you. He can't. The Catholic Church was the only institution on the planet, the only large institution on the planet, for about 1,000 years. And it was all about control over information. It wasn't until Luther and Gutenberg that started to break down. Because with Luther, I've been admiring your cathedral over here. It's funny to see a Protestant cathedral. Luther said that the people had a right to read the Bible. That the people had a right to a lot of things that they didn't have a right to. They had a right to a direct relationship with God. And at that exact point, or very close thereon, Gutenberg came up with a printing press, which made it possible for everybody to have the ability to read the Bible if they knew how to read, and many people learned on that account. And suddenly the whole balance of power was changed radically in Europe, and you had the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War and Spanish Inquisition and a whole bunch of nasty things that were the result of the people who'd had power losing their grip on it because they didn't have a grip on information any longer. So I knew that it was likely that if this thing, the internet, did what I thought it was going to do, there were going to be a lot of people who were going to try to stop it. And they would have many, many different ways of stopping it. Because it was not their friend. Might be in some ways, mostly not. And that has been the case. But it was all just theory to me when I first started writing about that possibility back in 86 and 87. But then things really started to happen. I got a visit from the FBI myself. Now, let me backtrack a little bit. Something had happened in the meantime, which is that Harper's Magazine, a magazine in the United States, had decided to do a Harper's Forum online about hacking into computers and about freedom and about forbidden knowledge and about what really very prescient about the morality of being able to access systems. And they had introduced into this forum some supposedly dark side hackers from the Legion of Doom, which sounded pretty heavy. And they show up, Acid Freak and Fiber Optic, and Acid Freak was spelled Phreak. Optic was spelled O-P-T-I-K. Then you get that style. And these kids seemed like they were just total nihilists. And for all I knew, they could bring down the entire communication system. I didn't know what they could do or not do. But they were punks, and I couldn't dig them. And at one point, I chided one of them for being a punk, and he said, well, if you're going to talk like that, how about this? And he downloaded my entire credit record into the forum. And then told me that he could change it. Now, in America, if you don't have credit, you might as well be in jail. I mean, I was imagining a lifetime for myself of standing in line in the post office to get money orders and stuff like that. It just wasn't pretty. So I was scared of this kid. And I wrote an email to him personally, and I said, I think we've exceeded the limits of this environment. I would appreciate it if we could get more bandwidth, and I think you ought to give me a call, since I don't have your number, and mine's easy enough for you to find. Actually, it was really easy to find because it was listed, but he didn't know that. So he hacks it out of the system in about 15 minutes, and ta-da, there he is on my phone to prove that he's really a master. And he gets on the phone, and suddenly my whole attitude towards him changes because his voice hasn't changed yet. He's so young that he's still, he's like 13 or something. He's just a pencil-neck geek kid doing what kids like that have always done at that point, which he wants to violate the forbidden. Well, actually, it's another forbidden that he wants to violate, but he has no clue how to do that. So in lieu of that, he's, crawling around virtually inside the phone system. And I could relate to him. I mean, I had broken into things that I wasn't supposed to be in when I was his age for the same kind of overall reason. And So I took a liking to him, and the next thing I know, I'm like the scoutmaster to the Legion of Doom. You know, and I'll get these phone calls from eight or 10 of them in New York, all on different payphones that they've hacked. And we don't have anything to talk to. They just want to show me that they can do this. You know, there are a lot of uncomfortable pauses after it's been accomplished. But I had an affinity for him, and so then one of them comes home, acid freak comes home one day, and finds that there are Secret Service agents in his house holding his 12-year-old sister at gunpoint, as they had been for a while, and removing everything that seems electronic or magnetic from the house. You know, they're taking out the clock radio, they're taking out all of his Metallica tapes. They don't know. You know, it's like they've been asked to bust a coven of witches, and they don't know what a broom is. You know, it's tough for them. And I think, well, God, maybe these kids are as bad as I thought. If the government's reacting with them in such an aggro fashion, maybe they really are this bad. And so I kind of backed away from them very carefully. I didn't want to get involved. And then I heard about another thing, a thing called Steve Jackson Games in Austin, Texas, where the guy who was running this game company had a game called Cyberpunk, which the Secret Service had decided was a manual for breaking into computers. In fact, it was just a role-playing game, but they didn't know that. And so they came into Steve Jackson Games and they took all of his computers, everything, basically just about bankrupted him. And I thought, well, maybe he had it coming. I don't know. But then one day, I get a phone call from a guy I know, Special Agent Richard M. Baxter of the Rock Springs, Wyoming field office of the FBI. And he sounds nervous. Now, I know Dick Baxter. I'd had cattle stolen at one point, and he'd been the investigator and had been real good with stolen cattle. He got right to it. And I'd had a friend who'd been made head of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and Richard Baxter had been the guy that came around and did his clearance check. So we knew each other, and I liked him. He was, you know, your standard FBI agent, which is kind of dopey and insecure and a little clueless up front. He gets on the phone and he's nervous. Now, you never want to hear an FBI agent on the phone being nervous at you, especially if he says, "I got to talk to you immediately. We cannot discuss this on the phone." Oh no. Well, you know, I'm still writing songs for the Grateful Dead, which has a relationship with certain criminal elements. And so I wait for Dick Baxter to drive from Rock Springs, which is about 100 miles, and I'm thinking about driving toward Jackson myself, the other direction, but I don't. And he shows up, and it turns out that what he's investigating is something called, he keeps calling it the New Prosthesis League. It calls itself the New Prometheus League, but never mind. And what the New Prometheus League has done, I think it's just basically one disgruntled person probably, it or they have taken a little bunch of the code, the written code, not assembled or interpreted, that runs the ROM chip in the Macintosh, and shipped it around to various people on floppy disks, saying that they'll ship the whole thing out, thereby having supposedly the Macintosh recipe loose in the world. You know, and then the Chinese will be able to make them, I guess. But Apple freaks out and tells the FBI that they must find this person at once. And somehow I get to be on the short list of people it might be. There was actually one point I had an FBI agent say to me much later on, he said, "We can't figure out whether you are the Unabomber or his next victim. It was a moment where I felt like I'd experienced success in some form. So Richard Baxter, he's at sea. He doesn't know what the hell has happened. I have to spend 2 hours explaining to him what the crime is, if it be a crime at all, before I can get around to explaining to him why I didn't do it. And he keeps putting his face in his hands and going, woo-wee. He said, my kid probably knows more about this. You know, when a man says that, it's bad. And I really, really don't like the look of very well-armed, insecure guys wandering around in places they don't understand. They're really apt to do something nonlinear. And so then I was spooked. And I wrote a little thing about this, and I put it on a bulletin board, which was frequented by a lot of newspaper journalists that dealt with the oncoming information age. And there it was read by a guy named Mitch Kapor, who had started Lotus Technologies. It's a distant memory now, but Lotus put out the first spreadsheet that was really usable, Lotus 123. And they were, you know, it looked like they would be bigger than Microsoft at one point. Didn't turn out that way, but at that point, Lotus was riding pretty fat, and Mitch happened to be flying over Wyoming in his business jet the next day, and he said, I received one of those discs. The FBI came and visited me. I haven't told anybody about this. It felt so weird. I would think that they would think I was crazy. I haven't even told my wife. You're the only support group I have. Would it be okay if I landed my jet in Pinedale and discussed this with you? You can't make this stuff up. So he does. He lands his jet in Pinedale, and we spend the rest of the afternoon calling up Acid Freak and the guy who runs Steve Jackson Games and various other wrong parties, and come to the conclusion that they, in fact, have been dealt with in an unconstitutional fashion. And we're going to go out and hire a big, nasty law firm in New York that did the Pentagon Papers. And we're not actually going to have an organization, because surely we'll get this sorted out pretty quickly. But had we had any brains at all, we would have known that it wasn't getting sorted out quickly. And the reason it wouldn't get sorted out quickly is because what we have here is a moment in history when every single existing power relationship on the planet is being renegotiated. Everything that you've been doing to get power and money is suddenly being renegotiated, and if you got power and money, you don't like that, and you will try to stop it. But at that point, we just thought, what the FBI and the CIA are doing is unconstitutional. I mean, these searches are overbroad. They're out of the bounds of the Fourth Amendment. They're exercising prior restraint on speech in some cases. So we're going to reassert the Constitution in cyberspace with a couple of surgical legal actions, and then things will be good. Well, we start doing that, and as we say in Wyoming, the shit really hits the fan, because the other side suddenly feels like they've been identified, and they're playing in a position of weakness. But also at about that point, I got an email from somebody in what was still the Soviet Union. Some kid had crawled underneath the barbed wire at the Finnish border with a twisted pair, so he could attach a modem in Finland to the internet, and the other end of the twisted pair to his computer. And he writes me an email and says, we hear what you've been doing to protect the American Constitution on the internet. What about us? We don't have a Constitution. And it dawned on us that in cyberspace, the Bill of Rights is a set of local ordinances. And in fact, no rights can be conferred in cyberspace by anybody, really. to the extent that rights can be conferred, it's almost entirely whether or not the architecture allows for the free flow of ideas, or it can be censored or constrained. That's the powerful thing. Or as Mitch put it really succinctly, architecture, by which he meant network architecture. Architecture is politics. And in the future it is and will be. So we decided we had to have an organization. We started one. We've been extremely busy ever since, and getting busier. I mean, we filed a lawsuit against AT&T last year for breaking their customer agreements by allowing the NSA to tap every single AT&T call, which they were doing. And the administration was so scared of this suit that the day before yesterday they got the Senate to pass a bill that immunizes AT&T and the other telephone companies from crimes they've already committed. That's a bad precedent, I think. You know, this is supposedly a law and order administration, yet they're immunizing people ex post facto. It's kind of a wild thing to do. But, you know, I'm sorry they did that, because I really wanted to be operating AT&T, which it looked like we would be if we won. Though that'd certainly be like the dog that caught the car. But I'm honored that they take us so seriously that they actually have to have an act of Congress to stop us from doing something. We have more leverage. Now, in the meantime, a lot of things have happened that show how much leverage you can have on the internet. Some of them not so great. I mean, when I was first writing about this, I thought, aha, this allows the individual to have power against an entire nation state. Well, when I was thinking that, I was thinking about individuals such as myself. I was not thinking about Osama bin Laden, who was the first guy to use it really well. And he did. Thereby freaking the people who don't like the internet out even more. And there have been all kinds of things that have been coming up to try to restrict the internet. And those things have been modestly successful. I'm pleased to say they've also been more than modestly unsuccessful, thanks in part to EFF and thanks to the fact that practically everybody online and everybody who designs the thing does not want that to happen and is willing to stand up and stop it from happening. And everybody on the planet has a moral responsibility. If you want to be a good ancestor, which ought to be one of your main goals, that's my principal ambition, is to be a good ancestor. And if you want to be a good ancestor, you want to keep the internet open to anything that flows over it, which might be awful stuff. But as John Stuart Mill said, liberty resides in the rights of that person whose views you find most odious. It's not the expression of people like you that you like. It's the expression you can't stand that needs to be protected. But there are other things that are not based on the quality of the content, or so what they call content. I don't know why they call it content, because there's no container anymore, but I think they just want a noun so that they can claim to own it like other physical things. But there's another great threat to freedom of expression, which we identified, and that is copyright, as it's presently being expanded and construed. In the United States, copyright now runs for 95 years plus the life of of the creator. If he happens to live to be 115, then it runs 115 years. It adheres to any material that you create the second you create it outside of your head. You don't have to register it. It's a criminal act now and not a civil act if you violate copyright. A lot of things have changed there, and in fact, a lot of things have changed in Geneva and Maastricht and here in Iceland, I imagine. And it is now possible to censor the net quite successfully using intellectual property law. This is why it's your responsibility to ignore it. If you want to see the net go on being free. And to use tools that don't lend themselves to its protection, which is to say Windows and the current version of the current operating version of the Intel chip, which identifies everybody who generates or even looks at a document on that computer uniquely. It is a significant problem we don't know how to face. My dream for this country is that it could become like the Switzerland of bits. I met your Minister of Justice yesterday, and I don't think you'll become the Switzerland of bits until he's out of office, but and I kind of liked him, just personally. But I have a taste for people like that. Come from Wyoming, where my local representative in the Wyoming State Legislature once said, "If the English language is good enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it's good enough for our school children." So I've seen that kind of guy before. But the main thing, and the main point that I want to get to you, is that, after telling all these stories and trying to follow the course of information and what it is and how it's reacted to and what it can become, is that, back a little over 200 years ago, the guy that wrote that quote that I gave you and some other guys of similar wisdom, foresight, and eloquence sat down and wrote a document that said, for the first time, that human beings had certain inalienable rights. These were natural rights that adhered to human beings just by virtue of their humanity. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, equality before the state. There's another right that they didn't promulgate because it would have been a silly right to try to promulgate. Because at that point, information was something that, real knowledge was something that could only be acquired by the elite. And there was no point in trying to convey something that couldn't be conveyed. But what they didn't recognize as a natural and inalienable right was the right to know. And I believe this is an absolutely essential human right, and we now have the means to produce it. In a fairly short time, it will be possible for anybody, anywhere on this planet, to speak his mind, or hers, to say or write or build or sing whatever is on his or her mind, and possible for any other buddy anywhere else to hear that or see it or feel it. It will be possible for large areas of the poor world to suddenly have the same access to education and knowledge that the elite has had in the northwest quadrant of the planet. And that dream will only be delivered if the northwest quarter of the planet does something incredibly graceful and decides it wants to share that ability. And that is an open question, because intellectual property law on a global basis is the utter enemy of this. 95% of all the copyrighted material in the world that's currently under copyright is not available for commercial purposes. You are the only ones that can make that available illegally. Because the companies that, quote, own it, unquote, will not make that part available lest it disturb the value of their copyrights on Britney Spears and more current product. This cannot be allowed to go on. You can no longer allow a situation to remain where, for example, the genetic code of the culture of Brazil, which is its music, is almost entirely owned by institutions in Los Angeles, California, who will not make it available to them in recorded form. It should no longer be the case that the government of Brazil should be forced to spend more money on licensing Microsoft software than it spends on fighting hunger. It should not be the case that millions of people all over the poor world die of AIDS because the companies that make the drugs that could keep them from dying refuse to make them readily available, lest it devalue their intellectual property. This sort of thing can't go on. And so, in order to create the greatest of humankind's creations, the collective organism of mind, and in order to be a good ancestor, which I think you want to be, I would call upon you to do everything you can to give people the right to know. Thanks.